AI Limit review copy provided by CE Asia. AI Limit is the latest in the already very busy Souls-like genre, and it feels like it arrives on the scene with something to prove. Over the course of my playthrough, which took me around 20 hours to complete, I saw firsthand a scrappy little game that brings several new ideas to the table. An interesting and complex combat system, a plethora of imposing bosses, and more. All for what seems like a more than appropriate price too. However, on the flip side of what should be a fairly impressive package is a game experience marred by a litany of technical issues and bugs, ranging from a mere nuisance to nearly game-breaking, and where, for me, some of those aforementioned new ideas the game introduces don't quite land either. So, in the very first review on the channel, we'll be putting AI Limit under the spotlight to see what the game has to offer before rendering a final verdict. Let's take a look. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't yet done already, consider hitting subscribe down below to help support the channel and help push us towards our next major milestone of 15,000 subs. A massive number of my viewers aren't yet subscribed, so consider doing so today. It's very easy, it helps out the channel a lot and makes a world of difference. AI Limit is an anime Souls-like, developed by SenseGames and published by CE Asia as part of PlayStation's China Hero project, an initiative for China-based developers that involves game development, publishing, and marketing support. There's no character creator to be found here when booting up for the first time. Instead, you play as the immortal blader Orisa, who is tasked with scouring the ruined cityscape of Havenswell, its subterranean depths, and more, in your quest to uncover the truth of the apocalyptic event that ravaged humanity and the planet. AI Limit is very much a Souls-like through and through, from its combat and systems to its desolate, hopeless world, various character questlines, and enormous boss battles. But it also feels like inherently a smaller scale game, and that's reflected in the price point, which we'll talk about a bit more later on. So how did I feel about my time with AI Limit overall? Let's take a holistic look at the game first, then dive into a few specific points that I want to discuss before wrapping this thing up with the verdict at the end. By the time I was finished with my playthrough, I was level 94, 20 or so hours deep, and had seen almost everything the game had to offer, including certain optional areas. For the most part, AI Limit is a perfectly fine, if unremarkable Souls-like that attempts to differentiate itself from its competition by introducing a few new ripples to the otherwise well-established formula. The biggest being the introduction of the sync rate meter, and subsequent removal of any kind of a stamina mechanic whatsoever, which can feel very liberating. In regards to the game's difficulty, I found it to be on the easier side overall, save for a few infuriating fights towards the end, and one particularly absurd piece of platforming, and I use that word loosely, that killed me more than any of the game's boss fights. AI Limit feels like an old-school Souls experience to me, and I mean that mostly in a good way. I've discussed before on the channel how the overall nature of the Souls-like has shifted in recent years, trending away from Dark Souls-style combat that lent the genre its name, and towards Sekiro-style combat instead, where the focus is placed squarely on parrying. Mastering the timing of battle to nail those perfect deflections and break your opponent's stance in a one-on-one duel of endurance and skill, as opposed to the shielding and dodging that dominated the earlier Souls games. Lies of P was a high-profile example of a Souls-like really feeling more like a Sekiro-like in many ways, and from what little I've currently played of the first Berserker Kazan, that features a similar focus on a more rhythmic flow to battle, where you simply can't miss a beat. While AI Limit does have a parry mechanic, and in fact it was the mechanic I used the most throughout, it's actually just one of 4 abilities granted to you over the course of the game by way of Orisa's special arm, the Soul Frame, and so can be swapped out interchangeably for a shield or something completely different, meaning your playstyle absolutely doesn't have to be dominated by perfect timing at all. That being said, the parry is an extremely powerful option in this game. In terms of the visuals, as you'll have likely seen by now, AI Limit's most striking characteristic is its anime characters, and they do look pretty good for the most part. They're colourful and creative, even if they do feel at odds with the bleak and shattered state of the world. To be fair, they do pop against the game's various backdrops and help to lend AI Limit a sense of identity, and there are numerous fun and creative customization options available for the playable character Orisa as well. The variation in enemies and designs is also better than I expected after playing the demo. During my time with the demo, which featured the game's opening sewer area, I wasn't all that impressed with the void creatures and occasional robot enemies on display, but the further into the game you delve, the more the enemy variety opens up and the designs improve significantly. The scavengers are downtrodden and often fight dirty, the Necros are sinister and terrifying to come up against with their mutated, bladed forms, while the church enemies and their general iconography is the game's strongest visual theme by far. The same can't really be said for the game's environments, which, apart from a couple of pretty standout areas later in the game, are almost all uniformly bland, uninspired, and frankly uninteresting to explore, and it can feel like you're often going through the motions, just moving through them from checkpoint to checkpoint. Exploration is one of the absolute highlights of a well-crafted Souls-like, and sadly, while the level design itself is perfectly serviceable here, with a couple of excellent and satisfying shortcuts throughout, the actual act of exploring what often amounts to pretty basic corridors or samey open areas is lacking. It's here where the game's smaller scale is felt the most, and it can be easy to find yourself lost and unintentionally backtracking due to how similar some places can look. That being said, there are a couple of genuinely cool set pieces and areas that I can't show you today, as they're almost exclusively found in the back half of the game. As I mentioned in my preview a few weeks back, the game opens with a sewer level, which is a terrible choice, and perhaps indicative of how much importance was placed, or lack thereof, on interesting environment design in the game. Then there's the game's narrative. Now, much like the visuals beforehand, really any element of the presentation, this is really going to come down to your own personal preference. Everyone's mileage will vary. But for me, I didn't get much out of the story here. The character designs are, like I said, quite nice for the most part. The major NPCs are fairly memorable, many of whom have their own stories and quest lines to complete, and there are some fun ideas to be had here. But ultimately, the world of AI Limit just wasn't that interesting to me, and it felt like something I'd seen before. The character of Orisa mostly consists of her just repeating questions back to people. An NPC will introduce a concept, and then Orisa will repeat back what they said, but this time framed as a question, and that's really the extent of it. To be honest, she's a blank slate, and having a character creator likely would not have made much difference to how invested in her growth you become. But then of course there's the combat, which is arguably the absolute core of any Souls-like, and here I think it is probably the main aspect of the game they actually get right, which is critically important. The combat is fun, it is engaging, and it can feel satisfying as well. There are numerous different ways for you to build Orisa to suit your playstyle, and numerous different ways to engage and participate in a fight. Whether you want to attack an enemy head-on, maybe try and stealthily deal massive damage with one of the game's fatal backstabs, parries, spells, all of that kind of thing, there is quite a lot of depth here for what otherwise amounts to a fairly small game. And that's partly why I feel like AI Limit is a game that feels as though it has something to prove. It is offering quite a lot here, more than you would otherwise necessarily expect, I think, from an otherwise smaller experience. Anyway, we'll talk more about the combat itself in a moment. Let's move on to what I consider to be the two biggest deviations from the Souls-like formula that the game has, its two newest ideas: the sync rate meter and the way currency works in the game. First of all, let's start with the sync rate meter, as it's an interesting mechanic, and the nexus around which the entire game revolves, and how it differentiates itself from other Souls-likes. As I mentioned earlier, there is no stamina bar whatsoever in AI Limit. Instead, virtually every action you perform in the game is controlled and affected by the sync rate meter, a new meter set right in the middle of the HUD, emphasizing its importance that goes from 0 to 100%, with the bar itself being broken up into 4 distinct levels, though the bar and the way it works in conjunction to you and your playstyle can be changed throughout the game, with specific items that help to alter your build and the way you approach fights. Every time you successfully land an attack, your percentage on the sync rate bar increases, and the higher your percentage, the more damage you'll deal and the more options are available to you. At the same time, taking damage, or doing really just about anything else, causes the sync rate bar to deplete. So, keeping your sync rate high is vital. For once you drop below a certain threshold of the meter, you won't be able to do much of anything at all. From using an ability to shielding or parrying to casting a spell, it all costs sync rate percentage. Crucially though, the game's core combat mechanics, attacking and dodging, don't cost a thing, and that's where the game does feel quite different. Unless your sync rate bar hits 0, crippling you and placing you in a staggered state where you're unable to move at all. It's a cool idea, and for the most part, well executed. While removing the stamina bar, therefore allowing you to attack and move freely, is quite a big departure, the introduction of the sync rate acts as a resource for you to manage in real time during the heat of battle. By making it so that landing hits restores your sync rate percentage, the game emphasizes and rewards aggression, but also by lowering your sync rate if you take damage or willfully waste and spam your abilities and spells and the like, it also punishes mistakes, impatience, and getting greedy. The sync rate bar is the game's core new mechanic, and I appreciate mechanics that transform battles on the fly, forcing you to think about your next move carefully, while encouraging you to step up to the plate all the same, all while slotting into how battles play out in an organic fashion. That being said, I do have some issues with how the sync rate bar has been implemented here as a blanket cover-all device that affects all elements of combat, because to be totally honest, the bar barely feels relevant or noticeable for the majority of the game. I only ever truly felt its effects when fighting a boss, when it was actually possible for you to really wind up on the back foot in a big way. The problem with making it so that successfully landing hits restores the bar and helps to keep it high is that the various mobs in the game aren't difficult enough to really deplete it in any kind of meaningful or impactful way, and so the simple act of fighting them keeps you powerful at all times and feeds into this endless cycle that I think does make the game easier. And so the sync rate bar's implementation doesn't feel like the balancing act that it necessarily should, until you get to one of those boss fights. Overall, the sync rate bar is a nice idea, but the execution is lacking a little. It's something that could be refined, I think, in a sequel. It absolutely isn't game-breaking by any means, and in the midst of a pulse-pounding boss fight, of which the game does have a few, particularly in the second half, managing it does become an essential part of your strategy. Considering you likely start most boss attempts at the full 100%, knowing what will use how much sync rate is imperative to establishing and maintaining the upper hand. Before we move on from the sync rate bar, I did run into something rather interesting during my playthrough. Removing the stamina bar from the game brings with it an unforeseen consequence. Because attacking is a core mechanic and doesn't cost any stamina whatsoever to use, it is surprisingly easy to just keep hitting an opponent over and over without letting up, basically as often as your animations will allow you to, and a lot of the time, certainly against smaller enemies, they won't be able to return fire at all, with their attacking animation winding up generally after your second strike or so, at least with a technique weapon that I found, only to be instantly dismissed by a brief stagger with the third hit that comes in just in time to stop them from attacking, and the cycle continues until they're dead. There's no penalty whatsoever for attacking wildly and unrelentingly, and again, it's part of the game feeding into this idea of aggression, but I do wonder if that was necessarily intended. Next though, let's talk about the way the game handles currency. For this is another key deviation from the usual Souls-like formula, and is in my opinion the most egregious thing about the game, aside from the bugs which we'll get to. The genius at the center of the Souls-like is the risk-reward element of how currency works. Currency in a Souls game holds inherent value, not just for buying items, but principally for leveling up. There is a time cost to gathering currency in these games. Currency is the core indicator of your progression and success in the game, but also of how much time and effort you've spent. Say you've spent a lot of time scoping a particularly dangerous area out and managed to kill all the enemies to make it through to the other side. Well, the currency you accumulated from each kill is your reward, and how much currency you now find yourself with is proof of just how much time you dedicated to doing it. Spending it on an invaluable stat increase at the next checkpoint is where the genre's incredible sense of self-satisfaction comes from. You earned that currency, and now it's materially improved your game and strengthened your character in tangible ways, ways you can actually see. It's a key component of a Souls game that when you die, you drop every piece of currency on your person with the option to then go and pick it up again. Should you then die again before retrieving that currency, then it and all of your hard work, progression, and time spent is lost forever. It becomes a game within a game, risk and reward. AI Limit doesn't do that, and actually eschews that system altogether. In AI Limit, when you die, you lose a flat rate percentage of your currency, here called crystals, forever, with no option to retrieve them. That sense of risk and reward is gone. Instead, it's just risk and more risk. Risk and frustration. It is frankly demoralizing to see a chunk of your hard-earned currency wiped out after a death and knowing that there is nothing you can do about it. It actively disincentivizes risk-taking as well as multiple boss attempts. In a Souls game, even if you do die to a boss and drop your currency, you can always make a dash to grab it again in the arena, and know that nothing but time was really lost. In AI Limit, if you're up against a particularly difficult boss, it is downright crushing to just watch your currency whittle away after each attempt. It completely changed the way I played the game, the way I approached the boss fights. Instead, if I knew I was going to face a boss, I'd try my best to spend everything I had beforehand, to go into the fight with basically as few crystals as possible. At least that way, the damage was mitigated if I died, and I could freely try again and again. Whatever little crystals I had left, no longer of any concern as they inevitably melted away to nothing. And so in that sense, it also kind of changes your relationship with the currency in the game as well. And in my opinion, this system is abjectly worse than the norm in almost every single way. On the one hand, it could be seen as ultimately more forgiving, as at least you retain the majority of your currency when you die, and have a foundation to then go and build upon in order to get stronger again quicker, but at least for me, I prefer having the option to retain everything, and to have to make that decision to decide how and where to risk my life again in order to collect what was lost, which in itself is another game. So, while I appreciate AI Limit for trying something new in a very familiar space, I can't help but think neither of the core ideas it brings to the table are executed perfectly. The sync rate bar is a nice idea that, for the most part, works well enough, though its impact isn't really felt until those key boss battles, though I wonder how someone who is totally new to this genre might find the sync rate bar in comparison. And meanwhile, well, I just don't really like how the game handles currency at all. Sadly though, regardless of whatever you think of the game itself, the truth is that the AI Limit experience is, at the moment, completely marred and bogged down by a laundry list of technical issues that were not only noticeable, but had an impact on the game itself. Although the game did receive a patch during the review period, these issues continue to persist, so hopefully the team has some kind of day one patch planned for tomorrow. But my time with the game was affected by all manner of issues that I felt were worth bringing up, from severe bouts of screen tearing that seemed to intensify the further into the game I went, to broken audio that completely cut out during a boss fight, leaving nothing but the sound effects behind. The screen tearing was so intense at points that it honestly became hard to look at, particularly when moving the camera. And by the way, I was playing this on a PS5 Pro, and I have no idea if it made any difference whatsoever, but judging by the performance, judging by the game chugging slightly at points, the frame rate drops, the screen tearing, I can't help but think it probably didn't. Other issues I faced included an everlasting loading screen, which forced me to quit out of the game, and a range of problems that plagued the game's enemies, from half-formed models to models that were almost entirely invisible, which admittedly was kind of funny to see. The worst offender, however, was an issue that occurred seemingly at random whenever I would teleport between branches, this game's version of bonfires, or if I had just died and was then respawning. Upon spawning in, my character would instantly die, losing currency, and then it would continue to happen on a loop again and again until I forcibly quit the game. Ironically, turning the game's rare safe spaces, the checkpoints, into one of the biggest contributors to my death count. Sometimes the game would look normal, save for my character constantly dropping dead, while other times I'd load in only for the entire game world around me to be black, causing my character to fall through the ground and into the void over and over, killing me again and again, wasting more and more crystals each time until I forced it to shut down. While I was able to finish a playthrough, there's no denying the various technical issues are incredibly noticeable and seem to get worse the deeper into the game I went. And so that all leads me to my final verdict. AI Limit is an ambitious title, and it feels like it has something to prove. And in many ways, it does succeed. When it works, the game is really fun. The combat is the best, deepest part of the game, with numerous ways to build Orissa's character to fit your playstyle. For example, I went for a technique build that emphasized parrying and dealing extra damage through those powerful fatal attacks, as the game calls them, before moving quickly and following up with a flurry of slashes, and the game's surprisingly deep well of enemy types always pose an interesting challenge. Plus, on top of that, there is a veritable catalogue of weapons for you to choose from. But there's also a lack of adventurous spirit here too, and maybe that's down to the game's smaller scale. The environments are mostly dull and lackluster to explore, and the narrative didn't do really anything to grip me and pull me in. The game loses its cohesion in the latter half too. It doesn't quite fall apart, but it definitely feels less meticulous in its craft. That being said, I mentioned at the start of the video that AI Limit's pricing felt appropriate. More than appropriate, in fact, and I think it's a key point that needs to be considered. At the time of writing, the game is £26 through a PS Plus pre-order deal at the moment, or £28 otherwise, which, to be honest, kind of feels like a steal for the amount of game you're getting here. At a roughly 20-hour or so playthrough, 22, 23 maybe, AI Limit is on the shorter side for a Soulslike, but at that price, it's tough to turn your nose up at it. There's a good value proposition to be had here. The technical issues plaguing the game are frustrating. If a patch is released that clears them up, this will be an easy recommend for Souls-like fans. For now, AI Limit is as buggy as it is ambitious, but that ambition and the game born out of it are both commendable and fun to play. Alright everyone, thank you so very much for watching. This has been the first review on the channel, so I'd love to get your feedback down in the comments below. And of course, let me know as well if you're planning on picking up AI Limit at all, and when you do get the game, make sure to come back and let me know your thoughts on the title as well. I'd absolutely love to hear them. Alright everyone, once again, thank you so very much for being here. Consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and let's talk games again.